We've been taught that a business is simply a mechanism for making money. You find a gap in the market, you identify a problem, you build a solution, you run ads, you scale, you exit. And while that formula may produce income, it rarely produces fulfillment. It rarely produces freedom, and it almost never produces work that someone wants to devote the next 30 years of their life to. That's why so many entrepreneurs eventually feel trapped inside the very business they dreamed of building. They started a company in pursuit of freedom and somehow ended up creating a more demanding job than the one they left behind. They become exhausted, disillusioned, burned out, not because they're incapable, but because they built their business from the outside in instead of from the inside out. So I want to propose something radically different today. I don't believe the greatest businesses in history were created because someone found an opportunity. I believe they were created because someone found themselves. See, Apple wasn't merely a technology company. It was Steve Jobs' obsession with simplicity, elegance, craftsmanship, and beauty rendered into products. His fascination with calligraphy and design, things that seemed almost impractical at the time, eventually influenced the typography and the aesthetic philosophy of one of the most valuable companies ever built. Disney wasn't simply an animation studio. It was Walt Disney's imagination turned into an experience the rest of the world could step inside. The company became an extension of the man. And when I finally looked honestly at my own business, I realized the same thing was true. My company is nothing more than my own suffering translated into tools that help other people suffer less. Every framework I've ever taught emerged because I desperately needed it first. Every coaching process came from a problem I had to solve inside myself. The business didn't begin with a market, it began with a life lived. And that realization changed the way I think about entrepreneurship forever. In fact, I would say something even stronger. Most people think they're trying to choose the right business. I think their business has been choosing them their entire lives. I think every experience that you've had has been preparing you for the work you're uniquely qualified to do. Every failure, every heartbreak, every strange obsession, every challenge, every moment where someone looked at you and said, I never thought about it that way before. You were collecting the raw materials for your life's work. And if that's true, then perhaps the entrepreneur's job isn't to invent a business. Perhaps it's simply to recognize the one that has been trying to emerge through them all along. See, I believe there are fundamentally two different kinds of businesses. The first is what I would call an opportunity-based business. You discover a way to make money. Maybe there's a product trending online. Maybe there's an underserved market. Maybe someone teaches you a business model and you replicate it. There's nothing inherently wrong with this approach. Many people become financially successful doing exactly this. But these businesses often have a ceiling. Eventually, the founder becomes disconnected from purpose because purpose was never the reason they started the business in the first place. The business was chosen because it looked profitable. And when adversity comes, as it always does, the emotional fuel runs out. Now, the second type of business is entirely different. I call it a spiritual vision-based business. Not because it has anything to do with religion or spirituality, but because it is animated by something deeper than economics. It starts with identity. Like, who have you become? What have you become? What have you learned that cannot be taught from a textbook? What patterns do you see that other people consistently miss? Because I believe a true business is not merely an economic engine. It is the rendering of your lived experience into a scalable vehicle for sharing the essence of who you've become to the world. I'm going to say that again. A business, in its purest form, is the rendering of your lived experience into a scalable vehicle for sharing the essence of who you've become to the world. And that single distinction changes everything. Because now your struggle has value. Your experience has value. Your personal quirkiness has value. No part of you or your lived experience is wasted, and everything becomes potential intellectual property. And here's the beautiful irony. The very experiences that most people spend years trying to cover up or avoid are usually the foundation of the business that you're meant to build. And that certainly has happened to me. When I was younger, one of my favorite television shows was The A-Team. Now, you may or may not remember it. I was born way back in the 1900s. But as a kid, I didn't love the show because of the explosions or the action scenes. What fascinated me was the premise. It was a group of outsiders, sort of misfits who didn't fit inside the system, people who had unusual skills, who traveled from town to town, helping those who couldn't protect themselves. And when I was in the first grade, my teacher asked the class, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And one kid said, "I want to be a doctor." Another said a lawyer, another said a fireman. I raised my hand and said proudly, "I want to be on the A-team." I didn't know then that the trajectory of my life was charted to inspire me to want to help people who felt helpless, who felt trapped in a system, who were tired of being bullied by life, and who wanted to reclaim control of their reality. You know, I think when we say these kind of things that other people hear, it sounds funny or crazy when we're kids, but we're not actually making things up as kids. I believe we are remembering our future. So, my mom used to say that I was like George Washington. You know that story where he chopped down the cherry tree and he said, "I cannot tell a lie, I chopped down the cherry tree"? I was radically honest, sometimes painfully honest. At times it felt like a weakness because I couldn't pretend to be something or someone that I wasn't. But decades later, you guys are telling me that's my superpower. I see the comments on the show, my authenticity, my vulnerability, my honesty. The thing that I once believed disqualified me became the very thing that differentiates me. So my question is, how many qualities inside of you have you dismissed because they felt too ordinary? How many gifts have you ignored because they came so naturally that you assumed, well, everybody must do this or have this? What if the thing that you've been overlooking is actually the thing that you've been preparing for your entire life? And that's where I think most people ask the wrong question. They say, what business should I start? And I think the better question is, who have I become and what is trying to express itself through me? Because once you answer that question, the business stops feeling like something you have to force and it starts feeling like something that has finally found its voice. Now again, if what I'm saying is true, then it changes the entire entrepreneurial conversation. The question is no longer, how do I find the right business? The question becomes, how do I discover what my life has already been trying to teach me? Because I believe every entrepreneur eventually builds one thing. They build themselves. The company is simply the visible manifestation of that invisible work. I think about the entrepreneurs that you admire most, the truly iconic ones. Their businesses don't feel separate from who they are. They feel like extensions of their identity. The company becomes the embodiment of a philosophy. The product becomes the embodiment of a worldview. And that's why those businesses succeed. They're not built around transactions. They're built around truth. Now, this doesn't mean every entrepreneur has to become a coach or a speaker. Far from it. You might build a software company or a supplement company or a financial advisory firm or a construction company or a real estate empire. I would say the industry doesn't matter. Who you're building from is what matters. Because a supplement company built by someone who genuinely transformed their own health carries a completely different frequency than one built simply because supplements have good margins. You hear what I'm saying? Like a software platform created because its founder spent years wrestling with inefficiency carries a different authenticity than software created because SaaS valuations are attractive. So the external business models may look identical, but the internal operating system is completely different. And people can feel the difference, even if they can't explain it. Because authenticity is magnetic and alignment builds trust. And trust has become one of the rarest commodities in the modern economy. We're entering a world where AI can generate articles and videos and images and podcasts and sales copy and emails, all the stuff in seconds. Information is becoming infinitely abundant, which means information is becoming less valuable. What's becoming more valuable is coherence, lived experience, story. Because AI can summarize 10,000 books, but it can't be your lived experience. That's why I believe your lived experience is becoming one of the most valuable assets you own. Not because your story has to be movie worthy, but because your story produces a perspective that no one else can duplicate. And that perspective becomes the foundation of your business. When I look back over my life, I can see the breadcrumbs everywhere. Like for years, I thought my life had been random, disconnected, one chapter after another with no obvious relationship. And then one day I realized every chapter had been preparing me for the next one. Like early in my career, I became fascinated with search engine optimization. And at first glance, that looks completely disconnected from personal growth and human potential. Totally unrelated worlds, but it wasn't. Because SEO taught me to identify patterns hidden beneath complexity. It taught me that underneath millions of web pages, there were organizing principles that determined search results. But that same pattern recognition eventually became the foundation of my coaching. Like today, I look for hidden operating systems inside human beings, beliefs, identities, nervous system patterns, subconscious programs. It's the exact same skill. Nothing was wasted. And I could look back and say, man, I wasted decades in drug and alcohol and sex addiction. But everything I learned in my recovery, from the importance of fellowship to the letting go of resentments to a structure like the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, it all set the stage for the frameworks and programs I'm designing today. And more importantly, for who I've become. My suffering became my intellectual property. And that's why I believe your greatest business asset may not be your resume. It may be the thing that you've spent your whole life trying to hide. Maybe it's your divorce or a bankruptcy or addiction or illness or insecurity or a failure or years of feeling different. Those experiences don't disqualify you. They are your resume because they gave you access to understanding that cannot be learned academically. I'm not saying everyone should build a business around trauma, but we've all experienced challenges, and overcoming those challenges has qualified you. So if you were sitting across from me and you asked me where to begin, I wouldn't start with market research. I'd start with your autobiography. I'd ask you to spend an afternoon with a journal. No phone, no distractions, no AI, just you. And I'd ask you 4 questions. First,